My name is Alessandro Corda. I'm a senior lecturer in criminal and criminal justice at Queen's University Belfast. I'm truly delighted to have the opportunity to interview Rossella Selmini for the oral history project of the European Society of Criminology. Our conversation is taking place in Malaga at the EUROCRIM conference 2022. Rossella is currently professor of criminology at the University of Bologna in Italy. During this interview, we'll touch upon different phases of your career and from there springboard into broader themes. Rossella, you've had a rather unconventional and very interesting career trajectory. Let's go back to the beginning. How did you first become interested in the subject of criminology as an undergraduate student?
Well, that's an interesting question for an Italian criminologist. And it's interesting because there are a lot of examples in my early career that could tell us a lot about criminology in Italy, actually. I have a background in law, as many other Italian criminologists, but I have a PhD in social and political sciences, and I was really struggling, as many other young students in Italy in the mid-80s, in finding a criminological program that was consistent with my interest at the time. My interest in criminology emerged during a class that I took with Massimo Pavarini, that is an important figure in the history of Italian criminology, even if he was not a criminologist, because that's the point in Italy. Many who self-define them as criminologists are actually coming from a variety of different careers. Could be lawyers in many cases, and in particular Massimo Pavarini was a professor of prison law, but his class was a class on criminological realism that was starting to be, whose works were starting to be translated in Italy in that period, etc. So it was for students in law who were looking for something more interesting, more sociological, etc. That was an interesting class. And but I kept struggling a lot. There were no PhD in criminology at the time. Actually, if I remember well, there were no PhD programs at all in Italy in the mid-80s. And so I tried to look at different opportunities around in the environment, and I applied at the European University Institute with a project in law that actually was rejected by the law department, but was found very interesting by a sociologist who was working at the time at the European University Institute, Alessandro Corda, who is a major figure in Italian sociology. He had been abroad for very long, and when he came back to the UA, he was at the end of his career. But he found my project interesting, and so I was admitted as a researcher at the European University Institute. That was probably at the time one of the best places where to start a career as a social scientist. So I had to completely switch my mind to different categories. Of course, I already had interest in sociology and history. My dissertation at the law school was on the history of female crime and was based on an empirical research. So I was already a little bit experienced in this type of work, but at the European University Institute, I really think I got the best I could have, especially with this kind of mentors like Alessandro Corda and other sociologists who were there. So this is very typical of the problems of my generation in Italy for what concerned developing a career as a criminologist. There were no possibility except maybe in the field of what we define as forensic psychiatry or psychology that was already pretty well developed. The only exam that I took at the beginning of the 80s during my university career was called criminology officially, was actually a class on psychiatric reports, all based and we had to study 100 of psychiatric reports on offenders that were completely uninteresting and based on that type of categories. So very complicated, but then things slowly change. But there are still the signs of the difficulties in developing a criminological career based on a sociological background in Italy.
So this is really interesting. So basically you trained as a sociologist and then you came back to criminology via the European University Institute. And Alessandro Pizzorno has had background in the US, so that was an important thing for you in terms of a certain approach to things and to sociological phenomena.
Yes, of course, his background, but also broadly speaking, not just Pizzorno, but the whole faculty at the European University Institute was very, very international, and this in the mid-80s in Italy was kind of nothing. I discovered the interlibrary loan, that was something completely new. So it was really a different place, based on a different structure of classes, etc. Interactive seminars, and something we were not really used to, and we are not yet completely used to, I would say. So he, particularly Alessandro Pizzorno, but all the faculty opened us a lot of international relations and connection and networks. So I was really exposed to a much more international environment than many other my colleagues at the time. I had this great opportunity, so that was one of the best periods of my life. And the parties at the European University Institute were great.
Amazing, amazing. And after earning your PhD, here we have another very interesting phase in your career. So you joined the regional government of Emilia-Romagna in northern central Italy in 1994, and then you've been working there for many years, and there you experienced in different roles this kind of switch from a purely academic research to a more policy-oriented research. So could you please tell us about what was going on in the regional government, what program was started there, and what was your role over the years in the regional government, especially dealing with public safety and policing, but broadly speaking, with this kind of policy-oriented research within a government entity.
Yeah. Once again, I think this is my biography is, I think, very representative of the way of work in criminological issues. I'm saying this in a little bit vague way at the time, in the 90s. And once again, as you said, this made my career, as you said at the very beginning, made my career unconventional maybe for the European context more than for the American context. Because in Italy, when you want to be an academic, there is a long process going through years and years waiting for fellowships and then finally for some kind of more stable jobs, etc. I started an academic career in that way, but after 6 months I said, no, this is not my life. I'm not going to wait 10 years bringing coffee to the professors. Also is a metaphor, of course. It's not that, but working for free or anything like that. And after my PhD, I had a couple of opportunities to go abroad that I rejected because I wanted to do other things. So I got a job as a manager for 3 years before going to the regional government. That was also this was also Pizzorno's suggestion. He always said to us, to the few of his PhD students, before starting an academic job, do 2 or 3 years of a real job, and it will be extremely useful to be a better academic. Anyway, I had this other job, and then at the regional government, suddenly, and this is also important not only in my personal life, but in the history of criminology in Italy, suddenly, because of a political intuition of the president of the time, of the president of the regional government, who was thinking, who was started to be concerned about alarm about criminality, concerning criminality, crime and fear of crime and feelings of insecurity, etc. And he believed that this would have become a major concern in political agendas at the time. So he decided to create a small group involving academics. That's another really interesting point. In those times in Italy, some government institutions, etc., were interested in having a relationship with the academic world. So around this small group at the regional government, in which, and that I applied as the younger criminologist at the time, they also created a scientific committee that joined together. I cannot really say Italian criminologists because there were not real Italian criminologists in the meaning that, I don't know what the meaning is, but I mean, it was a group of sociologists, including one who was studying crime trends, the first one who started to study seriously crime trends in Italy, Marzio Barbagli. There was Massimo Pavarini, Dario Melossi, that then became the core, the most important point of reference for what became the critical criminology in Italy. They were already working also with the journal that now is called Studi sulla questione criminale, but at the time it was called Dei delitti e delle pene. So, but they were, by training, they were lawyers, except for Dario Melossi, who had been 15 years in the US, so he came back as a sociologist, as a full sociologist for sure. So a lot of, and many other interesting figures, mostly from sociology, including people who are starting to study police, including, I would like to remember also Antonio Roversi, who was a sociologist who passed away very young, unfortunately, but who was the first one in Italy to do ethnographic studies with participant observation. So at the time I was young, and this was another exposure to a lot of interesting research themes, crime trends, crime prevention, police and policing, etc. And especially to a variety of methodologies, because I learned a lot from Pizzorno at the European University Institute, but my way of working was still mostly based on armchair criminology, except for my degree, in which I worked on documents from the trials against women who killed their babies. But I learned a lot in terms of doing research, especially quantitative research, but also quantitative. And that group represented a real improvement for Italian criminological studies as a whole, because at the time the academic world was still, I think, not very much updated with the European and American studies in criminology. It was very difficult to find funds for research, while the regional government in those years, we had the opportunity, for instance, to organize victimization surveys in cooperation with the National Institute of Statistics, that at the same time started to do the first national victimization survey in Italy. That was 1996, and we cooperated with them, and I learned how to write down a questionnaire, how to organize a huge survey, national survey or regional survey, exactly in those years, cooperating with the statisticians of the National Institute of Statistics. Probably not many know that around the world that Italy has one of the best victimization survey in terms of the sample, in terms of the questions and the elaboration of the data, etc., that unfortunately is not very much used, neither by the academics. So there is a huge amount of data that could have been used much more to improve research in Italy, and of course is not used at all by politicians. So that was a very interesting period in terms of professional development and also in terms of doing policy-oriented research. That is something that I really like to do, even if I know that there are advantages and risks in doing this kind of research.
So this is really interesting because of this focus on empirical research, both quantitative and qualitative, as you mentioned, which is still largely missing in Italian criminological research. So how do you think that experience contributed to the development of criminology in Italy? So at some point it was cut short, but do you think that there's a legacy of that experience?
Yes, and also at some point what happened was that the regional government was also working as a container for younger researchers who couldn't find any fellowship at the university. So we had a group of younger people. When I started to be more experienced and becoming more senior, we had younger people working with us, and the cooperation with the academic world became stronger and stronger, especially with Bologna, because the regional government of Emilia-Romagna was there, but also other universities around. We had strong cooperation with the group led by Ernesto Savona, Transcrime, that was becoming also an important point of reference for criminology in Italy. So I would say that during the 90s and the first half of the 2000s, there was really an interesting network of knowledge and of people working in this field, transmitting knowledge and research and cooperating in more empirical research. And I think this has been helpful also in improving more empirical studies in the academic world and in developing the idea of working as a criminologist also in the university. There are still problems that we can maybe talk later, a little bit later.
Absolutely.
But it was definitively extremely important in terms of for our country.
And your work in the regional government helps transition into your experience as a leading figure in the European Society of Criminology in recent years, because whilst you were working for the regional government then, you played a major role in organizing the European Society of Criminology conference in 2007. So I think that here we have this link between your work with the regional government of Emilia-Romagna and then your involvement with the European Society of Criminology. So could you please tell us a bit more about this?
Yeah. Before that, it's important to say that while I was working at the regional government, I always kept also an academic career. I was teaching in Bologna, and then I taught in Macerata for 6 years as an adjunct professor, but it was a way to keep these two worlds connected. So, and we, as the group of the regional government that was called Città Sicure, Safe Cities, because it was based on the experience of the criminological realism in Britain of the early 80s, was clearly modeling on that idea. But I kept a lot of relationship, and I kept a second job that was an academic job. So I kept publishing, and I kept working with students and supervising theses, etc. And we kept having a lot of European relationship, particularly European. I was working with the European Forum for Urban Safety, and I attended, not many, but some of the European conferences that started in 2002. I think I went to Toledo, was probably was the second, not the first. But anyway, and so at some point I said, why not organizing something like this in Italy? It would be incredibly important to develop criminology in Italy even more. And we really need a kind of a shock, a kind of a bigger exposure again to other ideas and to improve our contacts with other European countries in terms of the criminological research, etc. So the regional government was approved this project because they really believed important to be connected to the research also at the European level, and we created a partnership with the University of Bologna again with Marzio Barbagli, Antonio Roversi and Dario Melossi were the three most important people who worked with me in the organization of the conference in Bologna in 2007. It was the 7th conference of the European Society, and it was the first with very high numbers because it was 800, there were 800 participants, and at the time the average was 400, 500, so we were expecting a little bit more because it was Italy, but not 800. And so it was quite difficult to find rooms and to find and to organize everything. But it was a great experience, very different from the way the conferences are organized right now. It was much more based on our individual work, not on program that helps you in putting together the panels, but was very fun, and I think it went very well, even if it was a little bit chaotic, like everything is in Italy. But was an interesting experience also because it put together different souls of criminology. In Italy there is quite a big divide between, and already at the time was becoming evident, those who define themselves as critical criminologists, those who are more working on strictly empirical sociological issues. And that conference put together these different embryonic criminological works in Italy and also probably in the rest of Europe, because the more people you have, probably the more different approaches and perspectives are coming. And the European Society of Criminology started to be much better known in Italy, also from those who were part of the critical criminologist group and who didn't have the opportunity to have many contacts, and then probably realized that it was an interesting place where to be and to have exchanges.
This is really interesting, thank you. Like Italian criminology really needed kind of a shock into the system to bring together, as you mentioned, all the different tribes, you know, clinical criminologists, critical criminologists, right, pure sociologists. So then, after this organization of the 2007 conference, then you became over the years more and more involved with the ESC, first as an elected member in the board, and then especially as a president in the 3 roles over a 3-year period. And you had the idea during your presidency, was an initiative project that you started, the Oral History
yes,
project. So since we are now interviewing you for a project that you started, so how did you come up with this idea of starting an oral history project within the European Society of Criminology?
Well, it's really nothing very original, because I modeled on the American oral history project that I really liked. Maybe there is also my passion for history. This idea of preserving, I think was already very important. And I was thinking, okay, now European criminology is becoming something really very structured. There are major figures in Europe. We still are strongly connected with the American world, but there is, and I always believed that there was something distinctive about European criminology. This variety of approaches is common also in the US, of course, but I mean, and that is related to the different countries that we have in Europe. It's inevitable. I mean, we are much less homogeneous than the US, and I thought that preserving and making available the personal biographies, but especially, of course, as in my case, all these personal biographies are strongly related to the context and the development of the discipline. Making these things available to younger people would have been useful for the future. And I just modeled on the American Society of Criminology project that I was also using a lot with my students when I was teaching in the US. I used to show them the interviews with Rob and Merton, and of course after half an hour they were all sleeping, but I'm sure that something remained, and I still do the same with these classical traditional criminologist interviews with my Italian students now. So I think in the future, in 20 years from now or more, also younger students will benefit from our experience.
I couldn't agree more, and this is a very, very important project. It's very important for younger people to have a chance to not only to read their influential scholars, but also to listen to them recounting their lived experiences, linking personal biographies, as you mentioned, to their broader career trajectories.
I think this intergenerational, I had these thoughts exactly in these days, looking around in this wonderful conference, a lot of young people whom, I don't know, there was a group of Italian young people walking close to me, and I didn't recognize any one of them. And I said, oh, but they probably also don't know who I am. So I think it's really important to create, to improve the intergenerational connection. And this is a way to do that. And also is a way to follow, I think, the development of criminology in Europe with its local peculiarities. Because each country has, as I already said many times, different in the development, and I think that Italy is one of the most backward in many respects, but with an interesting story too.
Absolutely. So, before we touch on the state of the art of criminology and being a criminology in Italy today, and ask you a bit more about your research project and how they relate to the state of criminological research in Italy, I would like to briefly touch on your experience in the US, because truth be told, you're one of the few Italian criminologists who have also had the chance to teach for several years in the US in the Department of Sociology at the University of Minnesota, which is one of the best and most highly ranked in the country. So I would just like to hear from you briefly about your experience teaching American students compared to teaching in Europe, and I'm interested, as a scholar interested in comparative criminal justice, comparative criminologist, how did American students react to kind of the introduction of comparative materials and insights from non-American jurisdiction? This is something that I'm really curious to hear about.
Yeah, that was once again related to my interest in doing different things. Probably after so many years at the regional government, you know, the motivation was fading a little bit. I still keep thinking that criminology has really to be engaged in social and political life of the country, but at that point the political life of the country was not so wonderful, so I decided to change and to move and to go back to a more mostly academic work. And the US was a very interesting experience that I didn't want to do when I was 30, but I decided to do when I was 50. That's another unconventional thing, but things go in this way. And teaching was, I learned a lot from my students. I hope they learned a lot from me. I learned a lot in terms of, in the US, many professors started to tell me, oh, you don't have to teach, you have to entertain them. I said, what? In which, okay, movies, interactive, documentaries, etc. But I couldn't give up with my, of course, background that is giving a little bit of lectures, lecturing some. So, and I think they learned a lot. What was astonishing to me, once again in terms of generation and history, was American students, some of them are really great and wonderful, and they sometimes really lack this capacity to understand the rest of the world, and they lack this feeling of history again, once my student said, oh, wrote in an exam, wrote, okay, the panopticon, who was proposed by Jeremy Bentham in 1975. I don't know where he found 1975. So it happened several times. This is just an example, but it happened some other few times that they really have not an idea of the historical. And so I tried a lot. My class was criminology. One of my 2 classes there was criminology, and I worked a lot on historical materials, on the European origins of criminology, and I tried a lot to show them how criminological ideas traveled across space and time a lot, the connection of Lombroso with Latin America, and his trips to the US. Lombroso wrote a lot of stuff about the US, including about crime trends in the US. So, and they started to find this fascinating. And I'm doing the same now in Italy, actually, because these travels of criminology around the world is something that I always found very, very interesting and fascinating. And so now I teach also a class on globalization and crime, and so that's very much a history of globalization and crime, and it's much related to these ideas. So it was an interesting experience in terms of seeing a different world, a different way of teaching, a different way of doing research with much more money than what you can find in Europe, or at least in Italy, for sure. I still think that in Europe there is more variety, and it's still an interesting and slightly different world. And I hope it will remain. I mean, even if in the US studies are great, and actually criminological theories mostly developed there after the European origins. So it's an incredibly important point of reference for criminology, for international criminology, but Europe has a lot to offer too.
This is a very, very interesting perspective when it comes to exchanges, differences, and dialogues between the 2 criminological hemispheres on both sides of the pond. Because in times of policy transfers, also when it comes to methodology and approach to research, I think that it's very important what you're saying about the need for European criminology to retain and further develop its own identity and not being kind of colonized. Of course, we can bring over certain things in terms of rigor, methodological rigor, but I couldn't agree more that we have like a history, a variety of approaches. So I think that what you're telling us today, based on your experience in both continents, is very important.
And another thing that, just a couple of minutes on that, sure, because I think it's important. In Europe, we tend very much to model on quantitative American criminological research. And I always wonder why not the qualitative American research, that I think is wonderful, is not so much successful in Europe as the quantitative is. So that would be another interesting exchange, bringing to Europe and having exchanges with the ethnographer, with the American ethnographers that are well known in many cases, but they are not always taken as point of reference, as quantitative.
Yes,
American criminologists are.
I agree. So I think that now it's time to talk a little bit about, yes, the state of the art of criminology in Italy and being a criminologist in Italy today. So as we were preparing for this interview, we always touch on policing and kind of a litmus paper test when it comes to an area that at times is forgotten or tends to be forgotten in Italy because it's not squarely part of criminal law, criminal procedure. Then you are saying that in Italy criminology is I don't know if it's disappearing, but then we have different tribes. We don't have like a specific disciplinary sector in criminology. We have like sociology of deviance. Then there's the clinical criminology under medicine, faculty of medicine. So we have this issue, and we were talking about policing, which is really an area of expertise of yours as one of the victims, if you will, of these issues in defining what is criminology, what is not, what broader church it belongs to. And you have been researching policing in a more empirical way, and then recently you also wrote a book approaching policing from kind of a sociology and literature perspective. So could you tell us a bit more about your interest in policing in the Italian context in particular, and of course beyond?
Okay. Yes, you raised many different issues in your question, but talking about doing research on police and policing in Italy implies talking about doing research in criminology, empirical research in criminology in Italy as a whole, once again. Because the reason why I worked for years on this project that then became a book on the representation of police and policemen in European fiction books is, first, I was interested in these types of representation, etc. And I am interested in cultural criminology a lot. But second is, I cannot do research on police in any other way in Italy. Interviewing policemen is very complicated. You cannot even think of doing any type of participant observation, except maybe with the local police, which is more open. There are very few experiences of people in Italy who work with some few empirical interviews or data from police, but it's very complicated. Every time when I tried, it was frustrating and difficult. So I decided to use another kind of empirical material that were books, fiction books on police. But setting aside this issue, I'm still trying now to do, we just started at the University of Bologna a research project on women in police. The most ambitious idea was gender and policing, but it was too complicated. So I focused mostly on women and police in police jobs. That's something about which there is almost nothing in Europe. Very few research, many of them out of date at the end of the 90s, etc., mostly based on the US and the UK data. And so I'm starting that, and I know that I will have to struggle a lot, and we are actually now struggling a lot to get data. And we hope to do interviews, but maybe that since gender is now mainstream, very appealing in the political agenda, I hope that it will be easier than in other cases. But nonetheless, the problem of doing empirical research in Italy is still extremely important, especially when you need data from government institutions. Our Minister of the Interior is still not used to cooperate in terms of exchanges of data. It's really not easy to, in general terms, to have connection when you need data. So this implies that this is very common. It has been very common in Italy for a variety of reasons that we are not going to talk about now. It's related to the backwardness of the development of sociology as a discipline in general, and as a consequence, I think, also of sociological criminology. So it's still difficult. I'm also working on gangs in Emilia-Romagna, and once again, talking to, it's not easy to work with kids, but this is the same, to interview and work and doing empirical research with young kids, but this is common in other countries. But when it comes to talk to policemen who deal with these so-called gangs, it's once again very difficult. So The problem is broader. Policing is just an example. We could also say sentencing. Why there are not studies on sentencing, or very few studies on sentencing in Italy? And why, when there are international comparative studies, Italy is always missing? It's the history of the country. And at the same time, going back to the first part of your question, if I understood well, criminology in Italy as a broader theme, related of course to, in this case, to my current research interest. Criminology in Italy has developed a lot. Next year there will be a conference in Florence, and so it's not at all the situation that it was 30 years ago, or when we started our talk today. Of course, there are PhD programs, but there is not a department of criminology anywhere. There are some few programs, some masters. The PhD is in Milan, is one, the PhD program. And the discipline is still fragmented in these horrible, crazy disciplinary categories decided by the minister of the university, I don't know how many years ago. So I am, as an Italian criminologist, I am in the disciplinary group of sociology of law, deviance and social change. Roberto Cornelli, another Italian criminologist who works on police, and we cooperate a lot together. He is in medicine and law, or clinical criminology. I don't even remember the right name. And then there are those who are part of the more forensic, the clinical or psychological approaches. So now you find a variety of people, of researchers who define themselves as criminologists, but they are institutionally separated. But the institutional separation sometimes is also kind of a mental habit, becomes a mental habit, and it implies a fragmentation and some difficulties, I guess, I think, in creating really what we would define Italian criminology. Because now there is the group of psychologists, the group of sociologists, and then in the sociologists, those that are critical criminologists and those who are empirical or more quantitative or positivistic in a negative way, etc. All this fragmentation is really important and is strong. It's still pretty strong. So these are the problems: this type of fragmentation, the lack of data, and the lack of support in terms of funds and in terms of knowledge that could be more easily transmitted between institutions. I just summarized. There will be many more problems, but that's enough, I guess.
Absolutely. So before we get to the end of our very interesting conversation today, what do you think the future for Italian criminology is going to be? So I'm also thinking of the many criminologists very successfully working abroad, mostly female, I have to say, mainly in the UK. Now some are starting to come back, mostly working in criminology or sociology departments, so they are kind of they adhere more to what the international understanding of what a criminologist is. So do you think that if Italy is able to bring back, and you were a runaway brain who has come back, so how do you think that some forces from abroad, brought back from abroad, may contribute to a further development in Italian criminologies in, say, the next 10 to 20 years?
Well, it's a difficult question, but you already partially answered to that. I definitively think that that the exchanges, also in terms of coming back of younger Italian younger Italian criminologists abroad, that's an important phenomenon, really important, and I think it shows once again how complicated it is to develop a career in criminology in Italy that is completely satisfactory according to your research interest, etc. So that's why many young Italian criminologists, you are borderline between criminal law and criminology, but you also went to the US and now you are in Belfast. And as you mentioned, many other Italian young, especially women, criminology spread around the UK, Belgium, the Netherlands, etc. So it shows how difficult it is to create this career in Italy. If they will come back, as some of them are doing, despite the fact that I keep telling them, don't come back, but until, well, you are older. But at the same time, I think it's actually important if they come back, because of course they will bring different ideas, and that's, in Italy you really have to push to change things. It's a country that is very immobilized under different respect. So it's important to have people who create a little bit of shock. The first reaction when you say, why don't we call someone from abroad? But it could create an imbalance. There's an equilibrium now, why? And what we need is really to break this kind of false equilibrium that we have. Unfortunately, it's not our responsibility, it's of the single people. It's the system that is based on these unstructured careers, on this very precarious position. This has to change. And I think that people coming from abroad could also help in changing the organization and the system. I remember your article about criticizing very strongly the disciplinary sector. These are the things that have to be done and need to change in the next few years.
Yes, and I would say criminology is probably the first victim of this approach.
Yeah.
So Rossella, thank you very, very much. So at the end of this very engaging conversation, my final question for you is, in your view, what is a criminologist?
Oh, well, that's a question that I've been asking myself for most of my life, very difficult to answer, especially now in these times of fragmented criminology, theoretical, public, digital criminologist, whatever, green criminologist, visual criminologist. I could go on and on with this different specification of what is. But just to conclude, I think I can replicate the answer that a political scientist, I don't remember the name now, gave to a question about public policy, that it was, in this case, asked me what is criminology, and I say, actually, I don't know, but I know it when I see it. Okay?
Thank you very much, Rossella.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for watching.
Thank you to you, Alessandro, for this conversation.